So welcome to the lecture on the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. This video will only cover goals 1 through 4. I will do another video next week to cover goals 5 through 8. You can see on my screen as an assignment, United Nations Millennium Development Goals 1 through 4, and assignment United Nations Millennium Development Goals, Part 2, goals 5 through 8. You will be this week responsible for goals 1 through 4. The document that is attached to that is a Word document. It has all of the questions for goals 1 through 8 in it, but you will only be responsible for goals 1 through 4 this week. You will need to reference all of the material that you see listed on the screen now. I will lecture on this PowerPoint from 2005. It is from 2005. The target date to achieve the goals was 2015. So you will see here the PDF of the final report in 2015 of where the goals landed after 15 years. And then you will also see a PowerPoint here about the Sustainable Development Goals, which are things that were birthed after the Millennium Development Goal deadline of 2015. These are the goals that we're in now, the sustainable goals. As I said, I'll be lecturing on this, and there will be a lecture on just goals 1 through 4. Now, to address the questions that I'm asking you to do, okay, and each goal is going to have multiple questions to answer. You can use all of the resources that I just went over, but you might also have to just use your brain. You're going to have to think about some things. Some of them are thought questions, questions that you will have to wrestle with on your own and think about on your own. I'm asking you to stretch here with some of the questions we'll be asking you to stretch. None of the questions should be more than 2-3 sentences max. We're not looking for long-winded answers. 2 to 3 sentences, and some of them can be answered in a couple of words. So please do not overreach on this and do too much. We're saying answer the appropriate amount. If the question can be answered in a phrase or a sentence, answer it in a phrase or a sentence. If the question can be answered in 2 sentences, do 2 sentences, okay? We're not asking for much. So that's kind of the lay of the land. This is what you'll see when you look into your folder. You'll see these documents and the assignments, and of course this video. So let me begin then with the PowerPoint and talking about the goals. So as I said, this is from 2015. It is meant to be from 2015. I want to give you a snapshot of 5 years in. So the goals were created in 99 to be implemented in 2000. They gave themselves a 15-year window to work on the goals and to achieve as much of the goal as possible. And so with that being said, they took like a snapshot 5 years in. So we'll kind of talk about that. They'll have projections of where things are headed based on data that they've accumulated. And so this is kind of the United Nations first look 5 years into the United Nations Development Goals. To remind you of the goals, here they are. The first one is to end poverty. The second one is to achieve universal primary education. 3 is to promote gender equality. 4 is to reduce child deaths. Those are the 4 we're going to work on today. Next week, we're going to do improve maternal health, combat AIDS and malaria, ensure environmental sustainability, and then strengthen global partnerships. That's what we'll do next week. So let's talk then about eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. So by 2015, the goal is to cut in half the proportion of people living on less than $1 a day and those who suffer from hunger. So more than 1 billion people live on less than $1 a day. 800 million people do not have enough food to meet their energy demands, and 1/4 of all children under the age of 5 in the developing world are malnourished. What all of this means in 2005 prior to, is that people were living in with less than $1 a day, not being able to meet their energy demands. If you remember last week, I showed you the website where I typed in like the average teacher salary, and it said that I was in the richest 1% of the population, and kind of typed in the different salaries. Well, that website was born kind of out of this. In 15, 16 years ago, you would be able to type in $365 into that website. And $365 is $1 a day. And back then, even if you made $365 a year, you would still be richer than several percentage, like 2 or 3% of the rest of the world. So there were people who were living on less than $1 a day. And now, because of the growth of these goals, you see fewer people living on less than $1 a day. In fact, that website that I just referenced, they won't even allow you to put in $365 a year. So this is a comparison of 2005 is actually the numbers. 2015 is more of a projection of where they're going. And what you'll notice immediately, obviously, is that India and China have really big bubbles. India has 400 in 2005 had 456 million people in extreme poverty. In China, you had 208 million people in extreme poverty. The projections here put China way off to the side, a little small bubble there. India at about 88 million people, so they lose about 400 people. They get about 400 million people out of extreme poverty, a little bit less. The colors are important just to sort of look at regionally how things have improved. You look at Bangladesh. Bangladesh goes from 76 million in extreme poverty to 33 million in extreme poverty. Pakistan goes from about 35 million to being small enough it doesn't even have a number on it. So these are all the sort of the projections of this, right? And why this is important is two reasons, two things I want to point to this. India and China being the prime examples of globalization. Talk a lot about the process of globalization and how industry and business have begun to cross borders, and in so doing have lifted up countries. The fact that you have a cell phone that was in large part made in China is one of the reasons that China has gotten 200 million people out of extreme poverty. Work in India in the textile industry, in the service industry, again, has gotten roughly 400 million people out of extreme poverty. This is the positive of globalization. This is I sometimes like to rip on corporations like Apple and other industries because they come into these countries and they underpay people, or they do have environmental. They want to avoid environmental regulations, but what they do is they get people out of extreme poverty, and that is something to be acknowledged, something to be thoughtful about, because just within India and China alone, you're talking about almost 600 million people getting out of extreme poverty, and that's pretty massive. To think that that's what globalization has brought is within those two countries alone, almost 600 million people out of extreme poverty. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you notice, each bubble is a different color, where it's a different color because it's broken down by regions of the world. So blue is Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa to be specific. And if you look at that, you'll see Nigeria is the third largest bubble at 102 million people, and projecting 10 years later, about 96 million people in poverty. So really only a drop of about 6 million people in Nigeria. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, in fact, is increasing. They're predicted to increase the people living in poverty. And one of the reasons that's the case is because of the war and the conflict and the refugee crisis going on in the Congo. So they are going to go from 38 to 48 million people. Tanzania is only going to drop their extreme poverty by about 3 million people. So you're seeing in sub-Saharan African countries very little drop in extreme poverty, and in some cases growth in extreme poverty. So what accounts for the growth or the static behavior of extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa? I'm going to come back to that slide in a minute. I want to jump to this to answer that question. What accounts for that growth is conflict, refugees, and natural disasters. So these three charts, the one on the first one you see here on the left is about natural disasters. And you can see, obviously, it's broken down by regions of the countries, and you see how natural disasters can displace and harm and make worse extreme poverty and hunger to the tunes of tens of thousands of people being impacted by natural disasters. The other two, the one in the middle and the one on the right, have to do with conflict and refugee status. And so the one in the middle is about conflict. Look again, sub-Saharan Africa is the blue. 9 million people killed in conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa between the years 1994 and 2003. It's almost 10 million people in a 10-year period that have been killed due to conflicts. Add to that same time period, 15 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who've been displaced and are refugees. So you're talking 25 million people in a 10-year period displaced or killed. That has massive implications for your economic growth, your infrastructure, the strength of your country, when you're losing tens of millions of people to conflict and refugees. It exacerbates, it makes worse extreme poverty, hunger. And so those are the things that really kind of shape that, and to keep in mind that it's natural disasters and conflicts. So back up just a bit now and just talk a little bit about undernourishment, because this has, again, implications going forward with some of the other goals. And again, just draw your attention to sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, excluding India, because we've seen how India has had massive growth. Let's just look at those, and you can sort of see that, in the early 90s, this is the blue line, proportion of undernourished population. That's not a whole lot. You look at 04 to 06 and 08, not much movement. They're hoping to really go from about 23% of the population to about 10% of the population that's undernourished in these Southern Asian countries. And that's a pretty big jump. They're looking to go 13 points there to lower undernourishment in that region of the world. And same with sub-Saharan Africa, it's an even bigger jump. If you look, almost 30% of sub-Saharan Africa is undernourished, and they want to take it down to 15%. So that's a big 15-point jump that they're looking to try to address the undernourished population. So big jumps, big things, and again, what impacts those are natural disasters and conflict. On the right, you see a chart that talks about the prevalence of children who are underweight or suffering from a micronutrient deficiency. And you can see what South Asia just has. Almost half their children suffering from being underweight or they're anemic. Well, being anemic is problematic for so many reasons, particularly when you're talking about regions where malaria and other diseases can have terrible impacts for kids who are underweight or anemic or have vitamin A deficiencies or iodine deficiencies. And you can sort of see, again, sub-Saharan Africa is at or over 30%, and again, kind of keeping in mind these regions, Southern Asia, excluding India, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And this will come back, and we'll see the impacts of this chart here that we're looking at, the prevalence of child underweight and micronutrient deficiencies, when we look at some of the other goals. So goal number 1 is about eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, because let's be honest, until you do that, nothing else really matters. If you are hungry and living in extreme poverty, you don't have the energy to go about your day because you haven't gotten enough calories. Everything else is we can't talk about the environment. We can't talk about education. We can't talk about women's rights because you can't focus. So the reason this is goal number 1 is because that's what they want to achieve that. So afterwards, the next level of importance of feeding people is 1. 2 is education. And they want to achieve universal primary education by 2015. Importantly here, all boys and girls need to complete primary school. 115 million children do not attend school, but the target is within reach. This is a classroom in Southern Asia, in India, and you can sort of see, again, what I find intriguing about this is the rapt attention. Like the students in this room are attentive and focused, even though they're sitting on a dirt floor, with a pillow as a desk, and literally just laminated posters hanging around a concrete wall. Yet they're attentive and focused. They value the education that they are receiving. Here's some charts to talk about kids out of school and where those kids are, either economically, as the chart on the left will say, or regionally, as the chart on the right will say. So if you are to imagine for a second that you could divide the global income, like where people rank in income, into fifths, that's generally how we do talk about this in economics. So you have the richest fifth, the next richest fifth, the middle fifth, the second poorest fifth, and the poorest fifth. And again, not surprising to see that among the bottom 2 brackets there, we're talking about almost 38% of the kids in that poorest 20% out of school. You got 32% of the kids in that next group out of school. So you're talking about a large amount, about a third of the kids in each of those 2 lowest brackets out of school. And you look below that, and you look again about mothers, because mothers are so important in these goals, because mothers are the ones who care for kids. Mothers are the ones who are there. They're the ones caring for the family and nurturing the family. And if your mother doesn't have a degree, doesn't have a formal education, you're substantially more likely to not have one as well. On the right with the circle graph, you're just looking at regions. And again, the regions that I've been hitting on this entire lecture, Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, are the regions that we have concern when it comes to school and who's in school and who's not. Looking at youth literacy rates are important globally. And again, look at the 2 with the lowest, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. We're talking about particularly among females, less than 80% of their female populations in those 2 regions are illiterate. And that's a pretty damning statistic to think about with those 2 regions of the world. And again, this is 2005. Let's keep that in mind. These are some historical data here. But you can sort of see where the growth needs to happen, right? Why the growth needs to happen in these 2 regions in particular. This is a map, a global map of pretty much what I just was showing you. But that's something I want to talk about first before I go into a little bit of detail about this map. I want you to notice, again, with the exception of New Zealand, Australia, and Argentina, I want you to notice in the Northern Hemisphere, you're talking about pretty much solid blue, with the exception of Portugal, which is kind of a light blue, and Mexico and some Central American countries. But what does that tell us when we look at Europe being blue? We look at the United States being blue. What this is going to tell us is we see maps like this throughout these lectures. What I want you to really drill down on is the impact of colonization. The countries that colonized these Western European countries, even the United States, these countries that drove colonization, they're doing fine. And when we see charts on slum dwelling and sanitation and health, by and large, the countries in the Northern Hemisphere do a lot better than the countries in the Southern Hemisphere. And the overarching reason for that is colonization. The raping and destruction of the resources of the Southern Hemisphere countries, right? They were the countries that were rich in resources. Those were the countries that Western European countries and the United States began to exploit for their resources for generations. And they are now the ones who are struggling to catch up. And there are a lot of conversations we can have about how globalization and colonization are linked here. But what I want you to think about at this point is just noticing that and being aware of the fact that these countries that are have been exploited through colonization are now trying to catch up in areas of illiteracy and health. So this is what I would like for you to focus on. This map obviously is about literacy. It doesn't tell us anything that we don't already know. Again, the areas of concern: sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia. All right, goal number 3 is to empower women, not only to promote gender equality, but to empower them, to see them become titans of industry, to see them in the political field. And so they're really working on that. And to do that, we have to address the inequities of education first, but then hopefully build that into long-lasting political power for women. This is, again, a picture, and I apologize, I don't remember what country in Africa it's from, but it's an African classroom. I want you to just, in your mind, compare and contrast that to the picture of the Indian classroom, and see the walls here don't have things hanging from them. They're literally scratched things on the paint. They don't appear to be pillows. They appear to be crammed in pretty tightly to this, but you can still see that there's looking at the camera, there's looking at whoever's taking the picture. There's also students who appear to be really kind of trying to be intent on learning. It's interesting to compare this to that photograph from India. It's interesting to compare this to what you see every day at Central High School. This is, again, a global map of gender inequality in education. And again, I say this, it illustrates so perfectly the idea of colonization, the impacts of colonization. Sub-Saharan Africa, colonized by European countries. Southern Asia, colonized by Western European countries. And you can see they're trying to catch up on this issue of gender inequality. Gender inequality in employment is important, and I just quickly want to just show you this here on the left, talking about unpaid family workers. So who is valued when it comes to caring for families? It's women. Women care for the aging parents or the young children. And we verbalize often, well, we care about family. Family is so important to us. But our actions do not match those words. We do not pay for women to care for kids or to care for parents. Um, so yes, we may say we value those things, but when we value something, we pay for something, right? And so there's a dichotomy there. I think for us to focus on and hear and think about is like, what does it really mean to value something? You look at wage and salaried workers, majority of those, 61% of those are men. You look at people who employ folks, 79% of those are men. So the people who, and again, remember the time of this PowerPoint. We're talking about men getting to dictate the terms of what work is. Men get to define what work is and what work isn't. And so, again, you see this bullet point here, the rate of employment among women is 2/3 that of men. So there are 1/3 of women who need jobs who aren't finding jobs. Are those women caring for sick family members, for children? Or are those women just trying to get into the workforce but can't because maybe they didn't have the education? All of these things are part of that conversation that need to be thought about and talked about. And so that's what the purpose of these goals are, is to sort of flesh some of that out, put some meat on the bone so that we can figure out how we can make this more equitable for women. In government, we obviously are seeing more and more women in government. But again, in 2005, when this PowerPoint was created, Argentina, Mozambique, and South Africa sort of were kind of leading the world in women in government. And this obviously changed. And as I said at the beginning, some of the material in the folder that you will reference will show the growth in this. But I'm just trying to give you a snapshot of 2005. So you can sort of see that, the goal of increasing women in politics is in government is important, obviously, because the more women you have in government, the more policies shift, right? More policies can shift towards family-friendly policies, supporting female entrepreneurs. These can be things that when women are in power and governance, these can be things that happen, that are helpful. So goal number 4, and this is the last goal we're going to talk about today, is to reduce by 2/3 the mortality rate among children under 5. So every year, roughly 11 million children die before their 5th birthday. It's about 30,000 a day, and they die mainly from preventable illness. Now, obviously, this number is better than it was in 1980, but still, to think that 30,000 children die a day from diseases that are generally preventable, it's a pretty tragic take on that. It's a pretty tragic thing to think about. Again, here's a map of child mortality, but you can sort of see these green countries are countries that are making progress on this goal already. The red ones are countries that have made little progress or have suffered increases in both child mortality and undernourishment. And if you kind of look at some of the red countries, Somalia, Iraq, you'll see, obviously, particularly in the time of what they're talking about, 1990s and onward, conflict happening there. North Korea, some of the red countries. So you sort of see these countries maybe suffering because of conflict. So, all right, so that's where we're going to stop. We will pick up on this slide next lecture. I want to again reiterate here that you are just to do this assignment, part 1. You are to do that assignment. Understand that this is the PowerPoint that I just went over. This is the final report right here in PDF form and in PowerPoint form. And then you've got the sustainable development goals. Now, I'm going to say this again. Please hear it. Some of these questions are thought questions. Some of these questions are asking you to take what information you know and extrapolate that out and to grow that into a larger thought that you yourself have. Um, this is not a textbook, cut and dry, fill in the blank idea sheet or worksheet. These questions are asking you to dig deeper and to come up with answers on your own. The things that are being provided to you in this folder will help you, right? They may serve as a foundation, but they are not the whole house. You are going to have to do some of the building and construction on your own. I hope that is clear. But as always, if you have questions, email, let me know.